So today on our podcast, we're continuing to discuss a series of very small parks that Disney explored, partially developed, but then never built. In this, we're looking at interesting pieces of mostly forgotten design, as they once appealed to Walt. In our last episode, we discussed Walt's first two small-scale amusement parks that were tied to film. The first was imagined for the Burbank studio in 1939 with Bob Jones drawing up some loose concepts. And the second was for a series of regional parks to be built across North America and even international locations that would incorporate rides similar to those in the most iconic section of Disneyland, that being Fantasyland for a regional audience. Under this plan, there could be a partial day regional park in Washington State or Illinois or New York or even Mississippi, with Disney rides similar to those that viewers saw each Sunday as part of the introduction to the weekly Disney TV show. The major problem was that in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the cost of domestic airline travel due to industry regulations was significantly higher than it is today, which put long-distance vacations out of the reach of most families. That, along with twin recessions in the late 1950s and early 1960s, was one reason that Disney was exploring economical ways to bring some of the Disneyland experience to families far from Anaheim, creating small-scale amusement parks with Disney characters and theming. These micro-parks and planning materials were initially called Mickey Mouse Club Parks and then later Mickey Mouse Villages, likely to distance them from the Mickey Mouse Club TV show, which had recently ended production. Last time, we looked at how these regional mini-parks were proposed and how Disney eventually pulled back from creating perhaps a dozen of them. But at least one of the projects with a significant adaptation did move forward, wedged inside of a larger concept. Today we'll look at the story of that unbuilt regional park, a joint venture between Disney and an outside company to be built about 350 miles away from Disneyland, close enough so Disney managers headquartered in Burbank could easily visit it, but far enough away so as not to cannibalize visitors from Disney's big park in Anaheim. And that right there is where we pick up our story today. Act 3, Project Spring in Monterey. In the early 1960s, Walt Disney considered many ways to expand his company interests into new areas. Largely, these were satellite extensions of Disneyland, a way to adapt the cinematic design of that park to new audiences elsewhere in the country. Some of these efforts would eventually result in the massive resort in Florida. Others would be fully designed but never built, such as that impressive multi-story indoor park once planned for downtown St. Louis. The St. Louis park was intended as the original home for a Pirates of the Caribbean type attraction. But one of the lesser-known efforts that was developed during this time flew under the name Project Spring, a project that Disney explored with Del Monte Properties 7 years after the opening of Disneyland. In its design, Project Spring would eventually include elements of those unbuilt Mickey Mouse Club Parks or Mickey Mouse Villages into a larger themed development particularly focused on the history and the culture of California. Here's how this unusual project was developed. In 1962, Disneyland executive Jack Sayers traveled up to Monterey to visit with his friend George Lutzinger, a trip that would slowly focus Disney's interest again on Monterey. For 3 years, Jack Sayers had overseen the Disneyland Operations Committee, which was, at that time, the highest position in the park aside from the one held by Walt, and presently he was also overseeing the park's lessee arrangements. He intimately understood how Disney brought in outside companies to fill retail and restaurant space, which had been a financial necessity for the park since its opening. Through this, Sayers was also friendly with project managers who oversaw or had developed similar tourist destinations in California, specifically those that relied on lessees and sponsors, which roughly matched the Disneyland business model. Disneyland Incorporated at this time directly managed a few areas on Main Street such as the Emporium and the Main Street Cinema, but most of the shops and display areas had been leased to third-party companies. These included large businesses such as Kodak's and Upjohn's Pharmacy, and mom-and-pop outfits such as a bookstore and a jams and jellies shop. Throughout the 1950s, the leased areas were a considerable part of Disneyland. In 1958, for example, the park's annual payroll was about $10 million, about 70% of which came from Disneyland Incorporated and was paid to Disneyland employees, with the other 30% coming from lessees and being paid to employees who worked in their stores, their show areas, and their restaurants. Through this unusual network of lessee relationships, Jack Sayers had become friends with George Lutzinger, a property owner and business manager who had done well developing the famous Cannery Row section of Monterey. By the 1950s, Cannery Row, once known for canning sardines, had fallen into decline. Sardines, from being overfished, were disappearing from the California coast, leaving many canneries empty. In 1957, one of the old outfits, the San Carlos Cannery, burned to the ground. Others remained empty. The area was falling into disrepair, and property prices were on their way down. So Lutzinger, along with a friend, started to buy up the defunct canneries. They initially purchased just one. They sold the machinery, which then gave them enough money to buy two more. Again, they sold the equipment and repeated the process. From there, they formed the Cannery Row Property Company and bought up more real estate, including old shops and a near-empty apartment complex. In a short time, they came to own 14 buildings, many of them large enough to hold a dozen stores, restaurants, or offices. We'd naturally like to see something nice for Monterey come out of this, Lutzinger said. And from there, Lutzinger more or less followed the business model of Main Street of the 1950s, creating a retail area with both corporate and mom-and-pop lessees. In the early 1960s, Cannery Row included 2 art galleries, an Ocean View Hotel, a small theater where puppets performed, an upscale seafood restaurant, a knitting shop with yarns from Europe, a decor and curiosity shop, a gift store that sold exotic jewelry, a mid-priced Polynesian restaurant, a coffee shop, and a 400-seat theater for live performances and film. All of it wrapped up with exterior theming that paid tribute to the cannery landscape made famous in the novel by John Steinbeck. From the Cannery Row project, Lutzinger became friends with Jack Sayers, as they now had similar jobs. Sayers managed those lessees on Main Street and elsewhere in the park for Disneyland Incorporated, and Lutzinger was partially responsible for the lessees on Cannery Row on behalf of the property management company that he partially owned. As the two men grew to know each other, they exchanged business stories and offered each other advice. On this trip, however, the one that happened toward the end of 1962, Lutzinger told Sayers the story of another area developer who was trying to transform a different section of Monterey, slightly north of Cannery Row, into a tourist destination, a project that might possibly interest Walt Disney. The section of land was the famous Del Monte properties overseen by Samuel Morse, better known as either the boss or the Duke of Del Monte. The Del Monte properties, located on the Monterey Peninsula, included about 18,000 acres of land near the coast. Among the holdings were the 5,000-acre Del Monte Forest, the Del Monte Lodge, the Hotel Del Monte, 17-mile Drive, multiple golf courses, and Pebble Beach. In 1962, Morse was 77 years old, nearing the end of his life and looking to retire. He had managed these properties for over 40 years, since 1919. He viewed himself as an environmentalist and wanted to protect the natural beauty of his land, particularly the forest. Yet he also wanted to develop another section to serve the recreational needs both of local residents and of tourists. For a few years he tried to build a destination shopping village, but locals objected to his plans. He was now looking for a path to move forward with other slightly more interesting plans. The plans, as Jack Sayers soon discovered, were these. The Duke of Del Monte wanted to transform part of his property into an amusement park with a California theme. In retrospect, amusement park probably wasn't the right term, though this was the term that Sayers used when explaining the idea to Walt. More accurately, Morse wanted to develop a living museum focused on California history, with a few excursion rides to engage guests in the scenic beauty of the area. The idea was, in ways, shockingly similar to a recently abandoned project that Walt himself had considered a year or two earlier as a lifestyle expo once earmarked for unused Disneyland property, a project that had a couple of names, the first one being Vacationland, and the second and more lasting one being California Living. In Walt's version of this idea, the California Living Expo would have explored the lifestyles and outdoor beauty of California, the Sierras, the desert, the coastline, the Bay Area, and so on. These areas together would have created a new gated space at Disneyland to be built on part of the existing parking lot, though Walt eventually moved on from these plans. In contrast, Morse's Park in Monterey would retell through exhibits the history of California. Both Disney and Morse were interested in how the tools of staging and theming might represent the various cultures of California in a single destination. When Sayers returned to Anaheim, he typed up information about the Monterey Park concept in a memo and sent it to Walt, which explained what Morse was trying to develop on the Del Monte properties. As it turned out, Walt was familiar with the Del Monte properties in Monterey. Walt was generally familiar with most locations in California, from San Francisco down to Palm Springs and San Diego. But back in 1946, during an unusual period in the studio's history, when Walt consciously explored how Disney animation might absorb the style of modern art, he hired Spanish surrealist painter Salvador Dali to create a series of drawings and paintings that would serve as concept art for an experimental short film that eventually, many years later, was released as Destino. Walt spent time with Dali at the Hotel Del Monte at least once in 1946 during the third week of July to review ideas for that short film. But in retrospect, this trip likely served as Walt's introduction to the beautiful land holdings managed by Morse in the area. After reading the memo, Walt became interested in the idea and asked Jack Sayers to explore it further. This memo eventually, at least in one of its copies, would have a penciled note at its top in all capital letters, which read, "Confidential Plus." On his next trip to Monterey, about 2 weeks later, Jack Sayers spent a few days with managers associated with the Del Monte properties. Through them, Sayers came to understand the specifics of Morse's vision. He was interested in creating exhibits, elaborate models, and various educational attractions that would tell the history of California. Spanish settlements, early pioneers from the East, the gold rush, the development of the state's first capital in San Jose, and the Catholic missions that lined the coast. Morse and his property company were willing to invest $10 million in cash to engage the development, which was a sizable sum. In comparison, 3 years earlier, Walt had spent just $6 million to expand his park with the monorail, the submarines, and the Matterhorn. Del Monte Properties would also allocate 120 acres, which they already owned, for this museum-style amusement park. Initially, Samuel Morse was hoping that Disney would work just as a silent partner, with Wed doing the design work uncredited. But Morse quickly learned that the project would be more valuable with Disney's name publicly attached to it. The assurance of Disney quality, he soon came to believe, might actually help to overcome objections of local residents about a tourist-related development so close to the coast, especially after local objections had sunk his previous shopping village project. For the inclusion of Disney's name and the Wed design work, according to economist Buzz Price, they offered a 50% writing interest to Walt if he would join the development program. Early plans for the development included a museum, perhaps multiple museum buildings, as well as a view ride, probably similar to the Skyway at Disneyland, that would allow guests to see the surrounding land, forest areas, and ocean from 100 feet above ground. A boat ride and a walking trail that would take guests past a series of California missions recreated as 5-foot models. Some notes indicate that the park might also include, perhaps as a recreation, a nearby historic Spanish Presidio already located in Monterey. One rough layout also suggests that there might have been an excursion train, as the drawing features a line of railroad tracks traversing the property. From the start, both parties understood that the attraction elements of this facility, assuming planning reached the point of individual attraction design, would be completed by Disney. For most of 1963, Disney actively looked into a possible joint venture with Morse by commissioning economic reports in an attempt to better understand the profit potential of the Monterey tourist attraction. Economists hired by Disney explored the possible development from various angles. Were there adequate roads to support a large tourist attraction, adequate hotels, community support? Was the working population large enough to sustain a tourist economy? It's possible, I would say even likely, that Walt Disney quietly visited the land during this period. Specifically, on Saturday, March 9th, Walt and a few of his Wed managers flew to the Watsonville airport on the company plane. The official reason for their trip was to meet with a ride design company, Aero Development, which was partially owned by Disney, to discuss improvements to the Autopia attraction at Disneyland. Specifically, Walt wanted to personally inspect an Aero-installed ride at the Santa Cruz Boardwalk called Autorama, which used a new center rail system to guide cars down the road. Walt wanted Aero to incorporate a similar center guide system into upgraded Autopia cars Aero would design for Disneyland, thereby preventing freewheeling 12-year-olds from crashing Autopia cars carelessly into each other. Walt was at the boardwalk during the morning. Later that day, he was at the Aero plant near San Jose, but during this trip, he was within 30 miles of the Del Monte property. Walt often liked to view potential project sites without the pressure of a sales pitch. If there are any records to fully confirm that Walt casually drove through Monterey on this trip, I've not been able to find them. He certainly did not talk to Del Monte executives during this trip, but I see a visit here as a very reasonable possibility that Walt might have made the 30-mile drive, a quick and straight shot from Highway 1, from Watsonville to the Monterey Peninsula, to see the proposed site now for himself, so he might envision how new Disney wonders could be situated into this space by the sea. Regardless, in the middle of March, the Duke and the Del Monte executives did meet with Walt and company planners at the studio to discuss the project and to clarify goals. During this meeting, the venture was more clearly arranged as two related projects on the vast acreage of the Del Monte properties. The first project would be the tourist facility, with the living museum and a few scenic rides. But now a second project entered the discussion, a resort complex centered around a new destination hotel. The resort would feature golfing, water sports, hiking, and other outdoor activities. This new element would be referred to as the Vacation Village, which was separate from the museum area. In the middle of May, likely May 13th, Disney executives again met with people from Del Monte Properties to discuss how to best proceed. In my collection, I have no paper records of this meeting, but the concept was at least strong enough now for Walt to send 4 Disney representatives up to Monterey on May 29th. These included, once again, Jack Sayers from Disneyland, Walt's brother-in-law who worked with WED, Bill Cottrell, and 2 Disney economists and land use specialists, Buzz Price and Bob Hicks. But one of the main areas of project planning now concerned additional research to understand the local tourism market in Monterey. Economist Buzz Price believed that Disney needed a far better understanding of regional tourist patterns. Specifically, in a report, he suggested that Disney quantify the local market, the one-day excursion market, and the tourist market. He also felt that Disney needed a better understanding of seasonal tourism in Monterey, which was typically 10 to 20 degrees cooler than Anaheim, which could limit visitation in winter. These would be jobs for someone at Disneyland who already understood statewide tourism patterns, which again would make this Monterey project feel like an offshoot of the Disneyland brand. By summer, Del Monte general managers were no longer the point people in the Disney discussions. Instead, correspondence was being handled by Samuel Morse, the Duke, personally, likely suggesting that the Duke was strongly interested in proceeding in a joint venture and wanting to clear any remaining barriers. In a June 7th letter from Morse to Jack Sayers, he explained that the location for the park now would be in an area just outside Monterey called Deer Flats. This would place the Del Monte tourist area fairly close to the Cannery Row complex that had been developed by George Lutzinger. Morse also began to see this park in regional terms, advocating that this facility could offer both tourists and locals great pool facilities, as the beaches nearby were often crowded. The missions, all recreated in roughly quarter-inch scale, would be a tremendous draw for those people interested in California. He closed the letter by asking Jack Sayers to persuade Walt to come up to the Monterey property and explore it with him some weekend. Again, I don't have the exact date, but the trip appears to have happened in the middle of summer, as it is referenced in later letters. In August, likely after a visit to the Monterey properties, Walt asked Ed Edinger, who oversaw public relations at Disneyland, to come up with a list of comparably sized commercial recreation areas in California as a way to understand potential visitation patterns for the Del Monte project. Edinger came up with 4. Nut Tree in Vacaville, which combined unique shopping with table service restaurants, as well as a scale model steam train large enough to carry people. Though he did not have exact visitation numbers for Nut Tree, Ettinger estimated that the Nut Tree received between 500,000 and 800,000 guests each year. Second on his list was Hearst Castle in San Simeon, which 5 years earlier had become a California state park. For this, Ettinger had exact numbers. In 1961, Hearst Castle received 320,000 visitors. In 1963, 325,000. Next on his list was Mission Bay in San Diego, which offered boat rentals, public fishing areas, beaches, restaurants, and bars, as well as a playground for children. Ettinger also pointed out that SeaWorld was then being developed for the area, but wouldn't be open until the following year. For Mission Bay, he had neither attendance figures nor estimates. Last on his list was the newly opened Ports of Call in San Pedro, a themed shopping and dining area with specialty stores and 20 counter-service food locations and one table service restaurant with a Polynesian theme. As Ports of Call had only opened the previous month, he didn't have attendance numbers for it, but believed it was doing good business. He felt projects like Ports of Call signaled the public was becoming more interested in regional projects that combined themed shopping and dining with general amusements and entertainment. On August 23rd, a group from Del Monte Properties proposed that the Vacation Village area now include a 500-unit hotel with sea fishing and sailing options, golf privileges at Del Monte Greens, multiple swimming pools, lawn bowling and shuffleboard, tennis, beer gardens, and a bazaar-style shopping village. The amusements area, focused on California history, would now include a children's area with rides. Inside of Disney, this was viewed as a way to repurpose Project Satellite micro Disney parks into a larger concept. In the Monterey materials, Disney now called this a Mickey Mouse Club entertainment area. Again, this would be a collection of rides, most suitable for kids aged 2 to 12, similar to those attractions found in the Fantasyland section of Disneyland. Likely a couple of dark rides, a spinner like the teacups, maybe a carousel, and some other things. By the end of the month, Disney also had firm numbers on present tourist activities in Monterey, which were lower than hoped, including a report that placed only 300,000 cars on 17-mile drive each year. This number, at least initially, seemed lower than those attractions considered as comps by Ed Ettinger, such as the Nut Tree and Hearst Castle. To better contextualize this and to improve his case, Samuel Morse explained that each car likely held 3 people, or maybe 3.5 people, and that would give the area 1 million visitors a year, a number far more impressive than the figure of 300,000. He also pointed out that the area was on the way to other tourist attractions, such as Hearst Castle, for which Disney already had firm numbers. With a large attraction on the Del Monte property, the area would no doubt soon find an even greater number of tourists muscling their way to Monterey. The tone of the letter is that of a sales pitch, suggesting that in the light of some economic data, Morse felt that he now needed to convince Disney of the project's viability. Morse closed by saying what a pleasure it had been to meet Walt and the others from the Disney organization. Lastly, Morse explained that he wouldn't touch this amusement project at all unless Walt Disney was on board as a partner, as he now understood that the Disney name and Disney-level quality would bring an assurance of respectability and moral fidelity to the things they wanted to build. But from there, the project started to fall apart. On January 21st of the following year, economist Buzz Price, who regularly worked with Walt, assured Del Monte executives that interest was still running high for the project at the studio and that he hoped he would see Monterey executives more often in the coming year. Shortly after that, though, Disney began to lose interest in the development. In part, the problem seems to be one of focus. In the early 1960s, Walt was exploring multiple options for new developments, which in part may have been related to those two recessions. By 1962, however, the American economy was again beginning to rise, which suggested that Americans would have more discretionary income for things like a lengthy vacation. He also may have started to see that a micro park may have not been the best way to bring his idea of themed experiences to other parts of the country. At this point, Walt started to look at mid-sized Disneylands, projects smaller than Disneyland, but far larger than the proposed mini parks of the early 1960s. The most famous of these mid-sized Disney unbuilt themed offerings was in St. Louis, where designs for an indoor park there were just beginning to ramp up as the mini parks and the Monterey project were beginning to ramp down. But another problem was one of resources. Disney only had a certain number of designers and a certain amount of space at its WED facilities. By 1963, Walt was focusing far more of WED's attention on the New York World's Fair. He was also more pointedly looking to Central Florida as the place for the next full-sized Disney park. And that, more than anything, likely ended the prospects for a second Disney destination park in California during Walt's lifetime. With this, Walt's interest again began to move away from both the Project Satellite microparks and from the Project Spring Park with Del Monte Properties in Monterey. None of these facilities were ever built, though it is interesting to consider what a co-developed Disney project by the sea might look like, with attractions that focused on the culture and history of California, and rides similar to those Walt had developed for Fantasyland. The Project Satellite microparks, though unbuilt, did serve a purpose, and a rather important one, in the development of Walt's career. Without them, Disney might not have entered the World's Fair in New York. Robert Moses, who developed the 1964 World's Fair, originally asked Walt to build a Mickey Mouse Village-style amusement area at the fair. But after Moses met Walt and toured the WED facilities, they agreed that it would be far better for Walt to focus on more complex and prestigious attractions for the fair, which eventually included great moments with Mr. Lincoln, the Ford Magic Skyway, It's a Small World, and the Carousel of Progress. But these conversations about the fair, to some extent, grew out of Moses asking Walt about amusement areas similar to his then-current ideas for Mickey Mouse Club Parks or the Mickey Mouse Village Parks. And without Walt's involvement in the 1964 World's Fair, he might not have entered Florida, at least not on such a grand scale, as key components and personnel for the Florida project came from the World's Fair. And without a large facility in Florida, who knows where Disney would be now? But that story, how the project satellite materials helped pave the way for future developments, is one to say for perhaps another episode. So, I have a different outro for today. First of all, we've mentioned Riverfront Square in St. Louis a couple of times in this series so far. That was one of the big unbuilt projects from this era. There's no way to call that unique Disney indoor project a mini park. It was far, far too large and came close to being built. On Bandcamp, we have a 7-part series that covers everything about this unique project, from how it was developed to some of the unique attractions that were planned for it. It's arranged as an album on Bandcamp, so just click open the photographic icon. It's a picture of the St. Louis Arch being built, and you'll find all 7 parts of that series. Second, we've also mentioned Vacationland or California Living in Anaheim, which is a second park that Walt once wanted to build right next to Disneyland. We've talked about that project here on our podcast before, about 4 or 5 years ago. California Living starts out as a small project, about 9 or 10 acres, grows into something more, then becomes a small project again. But in going through the project satellite material for the Mickey Mouse Club parks, I recently came across some additional information on California Living from Jack Sayers. So I'm going to expand out parts of that episode and post it here midweek, as there are elements in that project that definitely connect up with the other mini parks that Walt explored during the late 50s and early 1960s. That is the exact same years we've been looking at for the past couple of episodes. I'll include the expanded California Living episode as part of our regular series here on the Lost Mini Parks. And then next Sunday, I'll be back with a new episode. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney Studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney Company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until sometime later in the middle of this week, this is Todd James Pierce.